Hey everybody, it's Mr. Clint with CCUA out here at our urban farm. That video you just watched was called The Story of a Strawberry. And that takes us on a journey from a strawberry plant that gets picked, washed, transported through its whole life cycle until it ends up in somebody's house and then ultimately in the trash. And that is the story of a lot of our food. About 40% of all the food we grow gets thrown away and never gets eaten. That's what we're going to talk about today is food waste. The food that we grow, that we buy, that we don't eat, that ends up in the trash, and what we can do to help. To help us understand food waste a little bit better, for this next part, we are going to walk through a few guiding questions. For each one, you can pause the video and take a few moments to reflect, whether that's with a small group or by yourself. Our first question we want to think about is, what happens when we throw food away? Where does it go? So go ahead and take a couple minutes and think about that, and we will be right back. Anytime we throw our food away, or anything away in the trash, we usually put it in a bag, put it on the curb on whatever day of the week trash pickup is, and then all that stuff gets taken to a sanitary landfill. You might have heard it called a dump. What they do is they take that food waste, they take all that trash, they put it in these giant piles, and then they bury it. And that's where all of our trash goes. Now, it sounds a little weird, but it's much better to have all that stuff collected in one spot where we can manage it. That way that helps cut down on litter and pollution and just makes it a little bit easier to handle. Our second question is, how much food do you think you throw away? Go ahead and pause the video, take a few minutes to reflect on that, and then we'll get back with you. So measuring our trash is a little bit tricky. So the numbers are always sort of best estimates. Everyone has different waste habits, but on average, each family will throw away a little over 200 pounds of food every year. Our third and final guiding question today is, what else could we do with that food? Instead of throwing our food waste away, is there anything else that we could use it for? So go ahead and pause the video and just take a couple minutes to reflect on that. There are a lot of things that we can do with our food waste. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal government office, they actually have a hierarchy of things that we can do to reduce food waste. We can kind of think of it as reduce, reuse, recycle. So the best thing that we can do is just to reduce the amount of food that is produced. In the United States, we throw away 40% of all the food that we grow. So the best thing we could do would be to reduce the amount of food that's produced. But that's a little tricky. And also, me and you don't run the big farms that are producing all this food. And we want to make sure that we do have enough food for everybody to eat. The next thing that we could do would be to reuse that food. So before food goes bad, we could donate it to food pantries. After that, we can recycle. And so when we recycle food waste, there's actually a term that we use for that. That's called composting. Compost is a way that me and you can help handle this issue of food waste, because we put a lot of energy and resources into growing all of that food that just ends up in the landfill. So compost is a way that we can reclaim that energy. We can reclaim the nutrients from the food and then use that to grow more food. Now, when we think about compost, there's really 4 ingredients that we need to have a healthy compost pile. We need browns, greens, air, and water. Now, when I say browns and greens, I don't mean we need things that are the color brown and green, although they might be. Browns are things that are dry, things that have a lot of carbon in them. A good example would be dried leaves. Things that are greens are things that are more wet. They have more moisture, they have more nitrogen in them. And a good example of greens would be food scraps. So you need a good balance of browns and greens. You need there to be some moisture in there, and you need there to be air. You need it to be aerated. And when you have all four of those things, that creates the perfect environment for the critters that are actually doing the heavy lifting in decomposition, what I like to call the FBIs. So the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates that actually break down these food scraps and this plant matter into finished compost or dirt. Like I said earlier, compost is something that you and me can do at home or at our schools. But compost can really be done at any scale, from just a small bin for your kitchen scraps to a community-wide, huge compost operation. So we're going to take a look at a few of the different levels that compost can happen at. So what we have here is what is called a vermicompost bin. So this is something that you can keep in your kitchen, under your sink, or in your pantry that utilizes worms as a primary decomposer to help break those kitchen scraps down. So we can take a look inside of this just to get an idea of what it looks like. And this is just a small one, but I have seen people have ones that are even half of this size just for their kitchen scraps at home. But you can see for our browns, we have some shredded up paper, and for our greens, we have some old lettuce. And in this case, they really are greens and browns. And I bet if we dig around, we can even find some worms. They're busy composting. And here's one right here. This is what we call a red wiggler. This is what we call a compost tumbler. This is something that's would be good on a more backyard scale. So if you have maybe a small garden, you could put your garden scraps in here, you could put your kitchen scraps in here, but it just gives you a little bit more space to work with. A lot of people also like these because they're enclosed and a little easier to work with sometimes. But they call it a tumbler because you can just kind of spin it around. Here we are at our compost site at our urban farm. This is something that's a little larger scale that would be impractical for most people at their homes, but works just right for a small farm of our size. Over here we have a very early pile. It's really early on. It's just been created. So you can see whole leaves, sticks, food, all of it right in there. And it doesn't look anything like dirt. It looks like a giant pile of trash. But given enough time and management, it will eventually turn into this beautiful, finished, dark compost. So this is what it looks like after it's all composted. Unrecognizable from what it was originally. And it's light, it is fluffy, it is super dark, and that is how you know that it is just full of nutrients. Now we can fill a wheelbarrow up and use that to build the soil up in the beds that we farm. So we are taking all of this old food, this old plant material, breaking it down into rich organic matter and using that to grow more food. We're out here at Derby Ridge Elementary now, out here at the school garden. So you can see we've got some nice garden beds and a lovely compost bin. So this is what's called a geo bin, and it's really just this sort of plasticky material that's been wrapped around into a circle shape. And all of the Columbia Public Schools that are part of our Farm to School program have one of these. So if you have a garden at your school, you probably have one of these compost bins as well. This is Bluebird Composting. Bluebird Composting is an example of a community-wide scale compost system. All of the food scraps at Columbia Public Schools is going to start becoming composted at Bluebird once school's back in session. You can see here one of their windrows. A windrow is a really long compost pile that just helps us be able to compost more food scraps. Bluebird uses fancy machinery like this tractor and compost turner. It takes food scraps from the outside of the pile and puts them on the inside. A facility like Bluebird will create almost 30,000 cubic yards of compost. That's about 500,000 times more than our little compost tumbler. We've talked a lot about compost today, about how it works, what it is, why it's important. So I thought it would be fun to show you a little activity that is very easy to do at home or at school, so you can see a little bit of decomposition happen before your very eyes. For this activity, we are just gonna need just a couple materials. We're gonna need just a little baggie, kind of like this. It doesn't have to be this size. Anything that'll zip close will work. And you can see I have filled this with a bunch of dried leaves. So these are gonna be our browns for our little compost system. Bunch of leaves, and we can even tear them up a little bit if we want. It'll help them decompose faster. So these are gonna be the browns for our little compost system. And then for our greens, we have a few old food scraps that we pulled out of the farm here. So we've got some kale leaves that we can toss in here. All right, after you've got all your stuff in there, you're gonna close it up, and then you're gonna shake it up, get it all mixed up in there. And there we have our little compost system. But remember what else we need? We got our greens and browns. We also need air and water. So there's enough moisture in these food scraps that we don't need to add any more water in. But for air, what we can do is take just this paper straw, and we are just gonna put it right over here in the side and just kind of zip that in there. Because if we did not, if we just left this completely closed, what would happen is this bag would actually inflate. And it probably wouldn't inflate enough to pop, but what's happening when all this stuff breaks down is it's releasing heat and gases, and that would just make it bigger and bigger and bigger, and it would run out of oxygen. So we're just gonna add that little straw, and that's just gonna allow for some gas exchange. And there we have our little compost system. And then what I like to do is to keep an eye on it. And so what I would also like you to do is to start a new entry in your science notebook, whether that is an actual notebook or a document on your computer. So I'm gonna put today's date, label it, compost observation, and I'm just gonna take a few notes about what I've seen, about what it looks like. So we'll start with day one. On day one, just a little bit of slight decomposition, what was already happening before we put it in here. So yellowed leaves, we've got no moisture in the bottom, which that will probably change as the days go by. And I'm not really seeing any growth of any funguses or molds or anything like that yet. Yeah, I think those are 3 good observations right there. But just every day, just take a look at it. You don't need to write a paragraph, but just a few things that you notice, especially if you notice that it has changed at all. So with this experiment, we are observing active decomposition. That means that those FBIs are going to be present, those fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates inside of here. Probably fewer invertebrates, but definitely some fungus and bacteria, and that will eventually make it kind of gross to the point where we don't really want it around anymore. So what you can do after you're finished observing your experiment would be to throw it away. I don't want anybody to feel bad about throwing food or food scraps away, because it is inevitable that that will happen a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are able, it would be super awesome if you were able to take your leftover experiment and add that to a compost system. Whether that is the compost bin in your school garden, if you have a compost system at home, if there's a community garden near you, really just anywhere that already has a compost system ongoing, or you could start a new one if that's something you're interested in. We just wanted to say thanks for joining us today. We hope to hear back about some successful compost experiments, and we will see you all next time.